The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, casting long shadows across the breakfast room where Princess sat with her steaming cup of tea. Her fingers wrapped around the delicate china, seeking warmth that seemed to elude her despite the cozy atmosphere. Across the room, she could hear the familiar sounds of her family beginning their day. George's excited chatter about his upcoming school presentation, Charlotte's melodic humming as she brushed her teeth, and little Louis's infectious giggles echoing from the nursery. But it was the sound of William's firm voice that caught her attention and made her pause mid-sip. He was speaking to George in that particular tone she had come to recognize over the past few months: authoritative, measured, and undeniably strict. The tone that had begun to create an invisible tension in their otherwise harmonious household. "George, you know the rules about your school uniform. Every button must be fastened correctly, your tie properly knotted, and your shoes polished. A future king must always present himself with dignity and precision." William's words carried through the hallway, each syllable carefully enunciated with the weight of royal expectation. Closed her eyes briefly, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that had become her constant companion lately. She understood William's perspective truly, she did. As the heir to the throne, he carried the weight of centuries of tradition and the knowledge that every action, every decision, would shape not only their children's characters, but potentially the future of the monarchy itself. Yet watching their 10-year-old son navigate these increasingly rigid expectations was becoming more difficult with each passing day. She remembered the conversation they'd had just last week, when George had come home from school with paint-stained clothes and a brilliant smile, eager to show them the artwork he'd created in his art class. While had immediately praised his creativity and enthusiasm, William's first response had been concern about George's appearance and a gentle but firm reminder about maintaining proper standards even during recreational activities. "Darling," had said later that evening when they were alone in their private sitting room, "perhaps we could allow him a bit more freedom to be a child. He's only 10. William had looked at her with those serious blue eyes that she loved so dearly, but which sometimes seemed to carry the weight of the world. "You know as well as I do that George doesn't have the luxury of an ordinary childhood. Every habit we allow him to develop now will either serve him well or hinder him when he takes on his future responsibilities." The memory of that conversation lingered as finished her tea and prepared to check on the children. She walked through the palace corridors, her heels clicking softly against the polished floors, past portraits of William's ancestors who seemed to watch her with silent judgment. Sometimes she felt as though she was walking through a museum rather than a home, surrounded by the weight of history and expectation. She found George in his room, struggling with his school tie. His small fingers fumbled with the silk fabric, and she could see the frustration building in his young face. His normally bright demeanor seemed subdued, and his heart ached at the sight. "Here, sweetheart, let me help you with that," she said softly, kneeling down to his level. As she adjusted his tie, she noticed the tension in his small shoulders, the way he held himself just a bit too rigidly for a boy his age. "Mama," George said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "do you think Papa would be disappointed if I didn't want to be king someday?" The question hit like a physical blow. She had to steady herself, maintaining her gentle smile while her mind raced. This was exactly what she had been afraid of, that William's well-intentioned but increasingly strict approach might rob their children of the joy and spontaneity that childhood should bring. "Oh, my darling boy," she said, pulling him into a gentle embrace, "your papa loves you more than anything in this world. His rules come from a place of love and wanting to prepare you for your future. But you are so much more than your future role. You're our son, you're George, and that's the most important thing of all." George leaned into her embrace and felt the weight of his unspoken worries. She had been noticing changes in him over the past few months. He had become more reserved, more careful about his words and actions. The carefree boy who used to run through the palace gardens with mud on his knees and laughter in his voice was slowly being replaced by someone who seemed to carry invisible chains. After helping George finish getting ready and walking him to his car for school, returned to find William in his study, already dressed in his naval uniform for the day's engagements. He looked every inch the future king, composed, dignified, and undeniably handsome, but could also see the signs of stress in the slight tension around his eyes, the way his jaw was set just a fraction too tightly. "Good morning, darling," she said, approaching his desk where he was reviewing his schedule for the day. Morning, William replied, glancing up with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I've been thinking about George's writing lessons. I think it's time we increased them to 3 times a week and perhaps added some formal equestrian training. It's important that he master these traditional skills. Felt her stomach drop slightly. William, he's already quite busy with school, piano lessons, and his other activities. Perhaps we could wait until... William interrupted gently but firmly. We can't afford to wait. Every year that passes is another year we're not preparing him adequately for what lies ahead. I know it seems like a lot, but this is our reality. The word reality hung in the air between them like a barrier. Understood that this was William's reality. He had grown up with similar expectations and had turned out to be an exemplary man and future king. But she also remembered the stories he had shared with her about his own childhood, the weight he had felt from such a young age, the pressure that had sometimes made him feel isolated and different from his peers. As William left for his morning engagement, found herself standing in the empty study, surrounded by books about royal protocol and constitutional law. She picked up a framed photograph from his desk. It was from last summer's family vacation, all of them laughing together on a beach in Norfolk. George was caught mid-laugh, his hair tousled by the sea breeze, looking exactly like what he was, a happy, carefree child. The contrast between that image and the careful, controlled boy she had helped with his tie that morning was stark. Traced her finger along the glass, wondering how to navigate the growing tension between protecting her children's childhood and respecting her husband's vision for their preparation as future royals. The day continued with its usual rhythm of activities and responsibilities, but found her thoughts constantly returning to George's question. During her engagement at a local children's hospital, she watched the young patients playing and laughing despite their circumstances, their resilience and joy serving as a reminder of childhood's precious, fleeting nature. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, observed the dynamics around their table. Charlotte, at 8 years old, seemed less affected by William's increasing formality, perhaps because the pressure on her as the Spare's daughter was different. Louis, still a toddler, remained blissfully unaware of the undercurrents of tension. But George sat than a child should need to, spoke more carefully than came naturally, and seemed to weigh each word before speaking. "Papa," Charlotte said brightly, "can we have a movie night this weekend? George said he wants to watch that new adventure film." William considered this for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "We can certainly plan some family time, but I think it would be more beneficial if we attended the cultural exhibition at the Royal Academy instead. It would be educational and appropriate for George to be seen at such events." Watched as George's face fell slightly before he quickly composed himself, a reaction that was becoming all too familiar. The spontaneous joy was being systematically trained out of him, replaced by duty and propriety. After dinner, when William was busy with his evening correspondence, found George in the library, supposedly doing his homework, but actually staring out the window at the garden where he used to play freely. "Whatcha thinking about, sweetheart?" she asked, settling beside him on the window seat. "Just wondering what it would be like to be normal," George said with a maturity that broke's heart. "Tommy at school says his dad lets him stay up late on weekends and eat ice cream for breakfast sometimes. He doesn't have to worry about photographers or proper posture or whether his tie is straight enough." Pulled him close, feeling the weight of his small body against hers and the enormous weight of the conversation they needed to have. "Being part of our family is special, George, but that doesn't mean you can't be a child too. You're allowed to make mistakes, to get dirty, to be silly sometimes." "But Papa says," George began. "I know what Papa says, and he loves you very much, but Mama has some thoughts about that too." Found herself making a decision in that moment, one that she knew would require a difficult conversation with William, but felt absolutely necessary for their sons. Later that night, as she and William prepared for bed, knew she couldn't put off the conversation any longer. William was reviewing notes for the next day's meetings, his dedication to duty evident even in these private moments. She loved this about him, his commitment, his sense of responsibility. But she was beginning to see how these very qualities might be creating unintended consequences for their children. "William," she began carefully, "I'd like to talk about George." He looked up from his papers, immediately attentive. "What about him? Has something happened?" "Not exactly," said, choosing her words carefully. "But I'm concerned about the pressure we're placing on him. Today he asked me if you would be disappointed if he didn't want to be king someday." The words seemed to hit William like a physical blow. He set down his papers completely, his expression shifting from professional attention to genuine concern. He said that. Nodded, settling on the edge of their bed. I think our little boy is struggling with expectations that might be too heavy for his age. I understand the importance of preparation, but I worry we're robbing him of the chance to simply be a child. William was quiet for a long moment, and could practically see him processing this information, weighing it against his own experiences and beliefs about royal duty. The silence stretched between them, filled with years of unspoken concerns and the weight of decisions that would affect not only their family, but the institution they represented. I never want him to feel burdened, William finally said, his voice softer than it had been all day. But you don't understand the weight of what he'll inherit. Every day we wait to prepare him properly is another day he'll be unprepared for the reality of his future. But what if, in preparing him for his future, we're damaging his present? Asked gently. What if we're creating a child who sees his destiny as a burden rather than a privilege? The question hung in the air between them as they prepared for bed, neither of them having easy answers. Knew that this conversation was just the beginning of what would likely be many difficult discussions about how to balance their roles as parents with their roles as members of the royal family. As she lay in bed that night, listening to William's steady breathing beside her, thought about the delicate balance they needed to find. She thought about her own childhood, growing up as a commoner with the freedom to make mistakes and learn from them without the weight of public scrutiny. She thought about William's childhood, shaped by duty and expectation from the earliest age. Most importantly, she thought about George, Charlotte, and Louis, and the kind of childhood she wanted them to remember when they looked back as adults. The challenge ahead seemed enormous: how to honor the traditions and responsibilities of the monarchy while still allowing their children to experience the joy, spontaneity, and yes, even the mistakes that make childhood precious. The moonlight streamed through their bedroom windows, casting everything in silver shadows. Closed her eyes and made a silent promise to herself and to her children she would find a way to protect their childhood while still preparing them for their future. It wouldn't be easy, and it would require difficult conversations and possibly some fundamental changes in how they approached parenting within the royal framework. But as she drifted off to sleep, felt a renewed sense of determination. Her children deserved to be both royals and kids, and she was going to make sure they got the chance to be both. The sound of George's muffled sobs coming from his bedroom at nearly midnight was what finally pushed past her breaking point. She had been lying awake for hours, thinking about their conversation from dinner and the increasingly rigid atmosphere that seemed to permeate their family life. But hearing her 10-year-old son crying alone in his room because he was afraid he had disappointed his father by spilling juice on his school shirt earlier that day was more than her mother's heart could bear. Slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake William, and padded quietly down the hallway to George's room. She found him sitting on his window seat, still in his pajamas, looking out at the darkened palace gardens with tears streaming down his face. The sight broke something inside her. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, rushing to his side. "What's wrong, my darling?" George looked up at her with eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. "Mama, I keep trying so hard to be perfect, but I always mess something up. Today it was my shirt, yesterday I forgot to bow properly to the ambassador, and last week I laughed too loudly at Charlotte's joke during that formal lunch. Papa keeps reminding me that people are always watching, that everything I do reflects on our family, but I don't know how to be perfect all the time." Felt her heart shatter as she pulled her son into her arms. This was exactly what she had been afraid would happen, that William's well-intentioned but increasingly stringent rules would crush the natural spirit of their child. She held George close, feeling his small body shake with the effort of holding back tears, and made a decision that she knew would change everything. "Listen to me carefully, my precious boy," she said, tilting his chin up so she could look into his eyes. "You are not supposed to be perfect. No one is perfect, not even Papa, not even the Queen herself. You are supposed to be kind and genuine and true to yourself. Those are the qualities that will make you a wonderful king someday, not perfect manners or never spilling juice." George's eyes widened at this revelation. "But Papa says—" "I know what Papa says, and I'm going to have a very important talk with him tomorrow. Your Papa loves you more than life itself, George, but sometimes even adults make mistakes about what's best for their children. Sometimes even parents need to learn and change." Stayed with George until he fell back asleep, her mind racing with plans and the difficult conversations she knew lay ahead. She had always tried to support William's parenting decisions publicly, understanding that a unified front was important for their children's security and the stability of their family. But watching her son's natural joy and confidence slowly erode under the weight of impossible expectations had finally forced her to acknowledge that silence was no longer an option. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching mood as she prepared for what she knew would be one of the most challenging conversations of their marriage. William was already dressed for his morning engagements, looking impeccable as always in his tailored suit and polished shoes. He was reviewing briefing notes at his desk when approached with 2 cups of coffee and a determined expression. "William, we need to talk," she said, setting his coffee down and taking a seat across from his desk. Something in her tone must have alerted him to the seriousness of the conversation, because he immediately set aside his papers and gave her his full attention. "What's on your mind?" he asked, though she could see in his eyes that he already had some idea what this conversation would be about. Took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Last night I found George crying in his room because he was afraid he had disappointed you by spilling juice on his shirt. Our 10-year-old son is developing anxiety about being perfect, William. He's losing sleep over whether his bow was deep enough or his laugh was appropriate. This isn't healthy." William's expression shifted from concern to something more defensive. "I understand your concern, but George needs to understand the importance of proper behavior. These aren't arbitrary rules, they're the standards he'll be held to for the rest of his life. I'm trying to prepare him." "By making him afraid to be a child." Voice remained calm, but William could hear the steel underneath her gentle tone. "By creating an atmosphere where our son thinks love and approval are conditional on his ability to perform flawlessly. This isn't preparation, William, this is setting him up for a lifetime of anxiety and self-doubt." The words hung in the air between them and could see that they had hit their mark. William's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, hurt, and then something that looked like recognition. For a moment, she thought he might be ready to acknowledge her concerns and work with her to find a better balance. Instead, he stood up and walked to the window, his posture rigid with tension. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under. Every decision we make about George's upbringing will be scrutinized by historians someday. If we're too lenient, if we fail to instill proper discipline and respect for tradition, we could be setting up the monarchy for failure. I can't take that risk." Felt her patience finally snap. All the months of biting her tongue, of watching her children's natural spirits slowly diminish under the weight of unrealistic expectations, of seeing George transform from a carefree boy into an anxious child desperate for approval, it all came rushing to the surface. And what about the risk of raising children who are so damaged by perfectionism and fear of failure that they can't function as healthy human beings, let alone effective leaders? She said, standing up to face him directly. What about the risk of creating future monarchs who see their roles as burdens rather than opportunities to serve? You're so focused on preparing George for being king that you're forgetting to help him develop the emotional intelligence and resilience he'll need to actually be good at the job. William turned from the window, his own frustration clearly visible. "So what would you have me do? Let him run wild? Allow him to embarrass himself and our family in public? Ignore centuries of royal protocol because you think it's too much pressure?" "I would have you remember that he's our son first and a future king second," shot back. "I would have you consider that the best kings in history were those who understood humanity, who could connect with people, who led with empathy and wisdom rather than rigid adherence to protocol. Those qualities don't come from perfect manners and fear of making mistakes. They come from being allowed to be human." The argument continued for nearly an hour, with both of them raising points that had been building up for months. William talked about his own childhood, how the structure and discipline had served him well, how it had prepared him for the challenges of public life, countered with observations about how that same rigid upbringing had also left him struggling with emotional expression and authentic connection at times. "You're an amazing king-in-waiting, William," she said during a brief pause in their heated exchange. "But you're also someone who spent years in therapy dealing with the trauma of your mother's death and the pressure of public life. Do you really want our children to need therapy to recover from their childhoods?" The mention of his mother and his own struggles seemed to hit William like a physical blow. Immediately regretted bringing it up so bluntly, but she also knew that sometimes the truth needed to be spoken plainly, even when it hurt. Their argument was interrupted by a soft knock on the study door. Charlotte's voice came through, small and uncertain. "Mama, Papa, is everything okay? We can hear you from the nursery." Both William and immediately fell silent, the reality of what their children were overhearing crashing over them. They looked at each other with a mixture of guilt and concern, realizing that their heated discussion about their children's was actually causing them distress. "We're fine, darling," called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "Papa and I are just having an important conversation. We'll be out in a few minutes." After Charlotte's footsteps retreated down the hallway, William, and stood in uncomfortable silence for several moments. The energy in the room had shifted from anger to something more vulnerable and raw. "I never wanted to be the kind of father who made his children afraid," William said quietly, sinking back into his chair. "I remember how it felt to constantly worry about disappointing my father, about not living up to expectations. I swore I would be different." Felt her heart soften as she saw the pain in her husband's eyes. She moved to sit on the arm of his chair, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You are different, William. You're a wonderful father who loves his children deeply, but loving them and wanting the best for them doesn't mean you have all the answers about how to raise them." "I just don't know how to find the balance," William admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "I know what the pressures of this life can do to a person. I lived through them. I want to protect George and Charlotte and Louis from that, but I also know they need to be prepared. Every instinct I have tells me that discipline and structure are the answer, but watching George become so anxious." He trailed off, running his hands through his hair. Knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. "Then let's figure it out together. Let's find a way to prepare them for their future while still allowing them to be children. Let's teach them about duty and service while also teaching them about joy and authenticity. It doesn't have to be all or nothing." For the first time in months, saw hope flicker in William's eyes. "You really think we can find that balance?" "I know we can," she said firmly. "But it's going to require both of us to be willing to change, to try new approaches, to admit when something isn't working. And William, it's going to require you to trust that our children can handle age-appropriate freedom without falling apart." They were interrupted again by George appearing in the doorway, his school uniform perfectly pressed but his expression anxious. "Mama, Papa, I heard you arguing about me. Did I do something wrong? I promise I'll try harder to be perfect." The sight of their 10-year-old son taking responsibility for his parents' disagreement and promising to be perfect was like a slap in the face to both William and. In that moment, they both realized just how deeply their approach had affected their child. William stood up and walked over to George, kneeling down to his son's level, something noticed he had rarely done lately, as he had been so focused on maintaining proper formality. "George," William said, his voice gentler than it had been in weeks, "you didn't do anything wrong. Mama and I were discussing how to be better parents, not anything you had done. And son," he paused, seeming to struggle with the words, "you don't need to be perfect. You need to be you, kind, curious, thoughtful you. Those are the qualities that make us proud, not whether your tie is perfectly straight or you never spill anything." Watched as George's face transformed, the tension leaving his small features as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Really, Papa?" "Really," William said, pulling his son into a hug that lasted longer than any had seen between them in recent months. "I'm sorry if I made you feel like you had to be perfect all the time. That was my mistake, not yours." As she watched her husband and son embrace, felt both relief and determination. This was just the beginning of the changes they needed to make, but it was a crucial first step. The road ahead would require patience, communication, and a willingness to constantly reassess and adjust their approach. But for the first time in months, felt genuinely hopeful that they could create a childhood for their children that honored both their royal destiny and their fundamental humanity. The conversation that had started as a heated argument had become the foundation for a new approach to parenting, one that would require both William and to grow and change, but one that might actually give their children the tools they needed to be both successful royals and happy human beings. The morning had brought difficult truths to light, but knew that sometimes the most important growth came from the most challenging conversations. As she watched George's smile return to his face and saw the relief in William's eyes, she felt confident that they were finally heading in the right direction. The weeks following their heated discussion brought a period of careful experimentation and tentative hope to the Cambridge household. Watched with cautious optimism as William made genuine efforts to soften his approach with the children, though she could see it was a struggle for him. Years of ingrained beliefs about royal duty and proper preparation didn't change overnight, and there were moments when his natural instincts towards structure and formality would reassert themselves. The first real test came during a family weekend at Hall, their Norfolk retreat where they had always felt most free to be themselves. Had suggested they spend the weekend with no formal schedule, no protocol requirements, and minimal rules beyond basic safety and kindness. She could see the discomfort on William's face as he agreed to this experiment, but she also saw his determination to try something different for the sake of their children. Saturday morning found George attempting to build an elaborate fort in the garden using branches, old sheets, and whatever materials he could scavenge from the estate. His clothes were already dirty, his hair was disheveled, and he was completely absorbed in his project, looking more like his old self than had seen in months. When William came upon this scene during his morning walk, held her breath, watching from the kitchen window to see how he would react. To her relief and surprise, William didn't immediately comment on George's appearance or suggest he clean up. Instead, he studied the fort construction for several minutes, then asked, "Do you think those corner supports are strong enough to hold the roof you're planning?" George looked up at his father with cautious excitement. "I'm not sure, Papa. Do you think they need to be reinforced?" Instead of launching into a lecture about proper planning and attention to detail, William simply said, "Why don't we test it and see? Sometimes the best way to learn is by trying things and adjusting as you go." Watched from the window as father and son spent the next 2 hours working together on the fort, getting progressively dirtier and more relaxed with each passing minute. When Charlotte joined them, followed by Louis with his nursemaid, the project became a true family endeavor. For the first time in months, heard genuine, uninhibited laughter from all of her children. But the real revelation came that evening during dinner. Instead of the formal dining room with its proper place settings and rules about posture and conversation topics, had suggested they eat outside on the terrace, picnic style. The children were animated, sharing stories from their day, interrupting each other with enthusiasm, and generally behaving like the kids they were. When George accidentally knocked over his water glass while gesturing excitedly about a bird he'd seen, tensed, waiting for William's response. For a moment, she saw the old reflex flicker across her husband's face, the impulse to correct, to remind, to use this as a teaching moment about careful behavior. Instead, William simply reached for a napkin, helped clean up the spill, and said, "That bird sounds fascinating, George. What color were its wings again?" The relief on George's face was palpable, and felt something tight in her chest finally begin to loosen. This was what she had been hopping for, not the abandonment of all standards and expectations, but the ability to prioritize connection and joy alongside proper behavior. However, the transition wasn't always smooth. On Sunday afternoon, while they were preparing to return to Kensington Palace, William's old habits reasserted themselves with a vengeance. The children needed to look presentable for the drive back, as there was always the possibility of photographers along the route. As William supervised their preparation, watched him slip back into his familiar patterns of detailed inspection and correction. "George, your shirt needs to be tucked in more neatly. Charlotte, let me fix your hair, you can't be seen looking disheveled. Louis, stop fidgeting while your nanny adjusts your jacket." The change in atmosphere was immediate and stark. The children, who had been chattering happily about their weekend adventures, suddenly became subdued and careful. The natural ease that had developed over the weekend disappeared as if it had never existed. Felt her frustration rise, but she also recognized that this was going to be an ongoing process. William's instincts toward control and perfectionism were deeply ingrained, tied not just to his royal training, but to his own anxieties about protecting his family from criticism and judgment. Breaking these patterns would take time and patience. That evening, after the children were in bed, approached the subject carefully. "How did this weekend feel to you?" she asked as they prepared for bed. William was quiet for a long moment and could see him struggling to process the experience. "It was wonderful," he finally admitted. "I saw sides of the children I hadn't seen in a long time. George was so creative and confident, Charlotte was fearless and funny, and even Louis seemed more himself somehow. But I also felt terrified the entire time." "Terrified of what?" she asked gently, though she thought she already knew the answer. "Of letting them down, of not preparing them adequately for what they'll face, of allowing them to develop habits or attitudes that will make their lives harder later." William sat on the edge of their bed, his shoulders sagging with the weight of his concerns. When I see George building forts and getting dirty, part of me thinks it's wonderful and exactly what childhood should be. But another part of me thinks about all the formal events he'll need to navigate, all the times he'll be photographed and scrutinized, and I wonder if we're doing him a disservice by not preparing him more rigorously. Sat beside him, taking his hand in hers. What if the preparation we give him isn't just about external behavior, but about internal strength? What if we teach him to be confident in who he is, so that he can handle scrutiny without it destroying him? What if we help him develop genuine leadership qualities like empathy, creativity, and resilience, rather than just the ability to follow protocol? But what about tradition? What about the standards that have guided the monarchy for centuries? William's voice carried the weight of generations of royal expectation. Considered her words carefully. I think tradition should serve the people and the institution, not the other way around. The traditions that have endured are the ones that actually serve a purpose, the ones that help monarchs connect with their people, serve their country effectively, and maintain the dignity of the office. But some traditions might need to evolve to match changing times and our better understanding of child development and mental health. Their conversation continued long into the night, touching on their own childhoods, their observations of other royal families, and their hopes and fears for their children's futures. It was the kind of deep, honest discussion that had been missing from their relationship for months, and felt grateful that they were finally able to address these issues directly rather than letting them simmer beneath the surface. Over the following weeks, they developed what privately called their new normal, an approach that tried to balance William's need for structure and preparation with his insistence on preserving childhood wonder and authentic self-expression. They established some non-negotiable standards around safety, kindness, and basic respect, while relaxing expectations around perfectionism and rigid protocol compliance. For example, George was still expected to be polite and respectful during formal occasions, but he was no longer criticized for minor imperfections like a slightly crooked tie or fidgeting during long ceremonies. Charlotte was encouraged to express her naturally bold personality, but within boundaries that ensured her safety and consideration for others. Louis, being the youngest, was given significant freedom to be a typical toddler, with adjustments made only for situations where safety or basic courtesy were concerned. The real test of their new approach came during a family appearance at a charity event, their first public outing since implementing these changes. Watched nervously as William prepared the children for the event, curious to see whether he would revert to his old patterns under the pressure of public scrutiny. To her relief, his approach was markedly different. Instead of lengthy lectures about proper behavior and detailed instructions about every aspect of their appearance and conduct, William focused on the purpose of the event and their role in supporting the charity's work. "Remember why we're here," he told the children as they prepared to leave. "We're here to learn about the important work this organization does and to show our support for the people they help. The most important thing is that we listen carefully, ask thoughtful questions, and treat everyone with kindness and respect. Everything else is secondary." During the event itself, watched with pride as her children engaged authentically with the charity workers and beneficiaries. George asked genuine, curious questions about the organization's programs. Charlotte charmed everyone with her natural enthusiasm and humor. Louis, though occasionally needing redirection, was his delightful, energetic self without being disruptive. There were small imperfections. George's hair got slightly mussed during an enthusiastic handshake. Charlotte's dress got a small stain when she bent down to pet a therapy dog, and Louis got momentarily overwhelmed and needed comfort. But instead of treating these as failures or sources of embarrassment, William handled them as natural, human moments that actually made the family more relatable and appealing to the public. The press coverage of the event was overwhelmingly positive, with several outlets specifically noting how natural and unforced the children appeared and how genuinely engaged the family seemed with the charity's work. One royal correspondent wrote, "The Cambridge children's authentic enthusiasm and natural curiosity were far more compelling than perfect protocol compliance could ever be." Reading these reviews that evening, William looked both surprised and thoughtful. "I never considered that allowing them to be more natural might actually serve them better in public," he admitted to. "People connect with authenticity," replied. "They can tell when someone is being genuine versus when they're just following a script. The children were more engaging today because they were being themselves, not because they were perfectly polished. This public success helped reinforce William's growing confidence in their new approach. Over the following weeks, noticed continued positive changes in the household atmosphere. The children seemed more relaxed, more communicative, and more willing to share their thoughts and feelings with both parents. George's anxiety about perfection began to diminish, replaced by a returning sense of confidence and natural curiosity. Charlotte's bold personality flourished without becoming problematic. Louis continued to develop as a typical, happy toddler. Perhaps most importantly, saw William beginning to relax and enjoy his role as a father more fully. Without the constant pressure to monitor and correct every minor imperfection, he was able to engage more naturally with his children, to appreciate their individual personalities, and to take genuine pleasure in their growth and development. The journey was far from over, and knew there would be setbacks and challenges ahead. But for the first time in months, she felt confident that they were building a foundation that would serve their children well, one that honored their royal heritage while also nurturing their humanity, that prepared them for their future responsibilities, while allowing them to experience the joys and freedoms of childhood. As she watched William reading bedtime stories to Louis, genuinely laughing at George's jokes over dinner, and encouraging Charlotte's dramatic storytelling, felt a deep sense of gratitude and hope. They were creating something new together, a way of royal parenting that honored the past while embracing a more emotionally intelligent future. And most importantly, they were raising children who might someday be excellent monarchs precisely because they had been allowed to be authentic, confident, and emotionally healthy human beings first. The true test of and William's new parenting philosophy came unexpectedly during the autumn half-term, when what should have been a routine family visit to Scotland turned into a crisis that challenged everything they had been working toward. The family had been invited to Balmoral for a traditional Highland Games celebration, an event that combined public appearances with family time and provided an opportunity for the children to connect with their Scottish heritage. Had been looking forward to the visit, seeing it as a chance to showcase the positive changes in their family dynamic while still honoring royal traditions. The children were excited about the trip, particularly George, who had been reading about Highland Games activities and was eager to try his hand at some of the traditional sports. Even William seemed more relaxed than usual, having embraced their new approach and grown more confident in balancing formal expectations with family authenticity. However, their arrival at Balmoral immediately presented unexpected challenges. The Queen, now in her late 90s but still sharp and observant, noticed immediately that the family dynamic had changed since their last visit. During their first formal dinner, she observed George's more relaxed posture, Charlotte's animated storytelling, and the general decrease in what she would consider proper formality among the children. "Dear," the Queen said privately after dinner, her tone pleasant but carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of concern, "I've noticed some changes in the children's bearing. Perhaps they've become a bit too comfortable with casual behavior." Felt her stomach tighten, recognizing the delicate position she was in. The Queen's approval wasn't just personally important. It carried significant weight for the future of the monarchy and the children's place within it. Yet also knew that retreating from the progress they had made would be devastating for her children's emotional well-being. "Your Majesty," replied carefully, "William and I have been working to help the children develop confidence and authenticity alongside their formal training. We believe that genuine engagement serves the monarchy better than rigid adherence to protocol without understanding its purpose." The Queen's expression remained neutral, but could sense her skepticism. Tradition exists for a reason. These protocols weren't developed arbitrarily. They serve to maintain the dignity and mystery that keep the monarchy relevant and respected. That evening shared the Queen's concerns with William, watching as his face went through a complex series of emotions: worry, frustration, and something that looked like fear. She could see him questioning their new approach, wondering if they had gone too far in relaxing their standards. "Maybe she's right," William said, packing their bedroom at Balmoral. What if we're setting the children up for criticism and failure? What if our approach works fine in private but doesn't translate to formal royal duties?" Felt a familiar surge of protectiveness for both her husband and her children. "William, remember why we made these changes. Remember George crying because he thought he had disappointed you over spilled juice. Remember how anxious and withdrawn the children were becoming. Are you willing to go back to that?" Before William could respond, they were interrupted by a soft knock on their door. Charlotte appeared, looking uncharacteristically subdued and uncertain. "Mama, Papa," she said quietly, "Great-Granny asked me to come see her tomorrow morning to talk about proper princess behavior. Did I do something wrong at dinner?" Heart sank as she saw the familiar anxiety creeping back into her daughter's expression, the same anxiety they had worked so hard to alleviate over the past few months. William's face reflected her own concern as they both realized that their children were already sensing the shift in expectations. "No, sweetheart," said quickly, pulling Charlotte into a hug. "You didn't do anything wrong. Great-Granny just wants to spend some special time with you." After Charlotte returned to her room, William sat in heavy silence, both recognizing the crossroads they had reached. The pressure from the Queen wasn't something they could simply ignore, but reverting to their old patterns felt like a betrayal of everything they had learned about their children's needs. The next morning brought the Highland Games, and with them, a situation that would test every principle and William had been developing. George had been looking forward to participating in some of the children's competitions, particularly the stone throwing and the sack races. However, as they prepared for the public portion of the day, the Queen made it clear that she expected the children to observe from the royal box rather than participate directly. "It's more dignified," she explained to William, "and it maintains appropriate distance between the royal family and the common competitions. Observation and gracious appreciation are skills they need to develop." Watched as George's face fell upon learning that he wouldn't be able to participate as he had hoped. The disappointment was crushing for a 10-year-old who had been imagining himself trying traditional Scottish sports, but more concerning was the way he immediately tried to hide his feelings and present a stoic, accepting facade. "Of course, Great-Granny," George said politely, his voice carefully controlled. "I understand." The old George, the anxious, overly careful boy they had been trying to help, was reasserting himself under pressure, and felt her resolve harden. This was exactly the kind of situation where their new approach needed to be tested and, if necessary, defended. During the games, watched her children sit properly in the royal box, applauding politely at appropriate moments, but she could see the longing in George's eyes as he watched other children his age participate in the competitions. Charlotte, too, seemed subdued, her natural enthusiasm carefully contained. It was Louis who provided the catalyst for what happened next. As a typical toddler, he had limited patience for sitting still and watching from a distance. When the children's sack race began, he pointed excitedly and declared loudly enough for nearby spectators to hear, "I want to do that. That looks fun." The Queen's expression showed clear disapproval at this breach of decorum, and could see William tense beside her. But as she watched her youngest son's natural enthusiasm being stifled in real time, made a decision that surprised even herself. "Would you like to watch from closer to the field?" she asked Louis, loud enough for the Queen to hear. "We could walk down and get a better view." Without waiting for permission or approval, stood up and extended her hand to Louis, then looked at George and Charlotte. "Would you like to come too? We can watch the next race from the sidelines." The Queen's displeasure was evident, but she was in a public setting and couldn't create a scene. William looked torn between supporting his wife and deferring to his grandmother, but when he saw the hope flickering in George's eyes, he made his choice. "That sounds like a lovely idea," he said, standing to join them. "We can see the traditional techniques much better from closer range." As they walked down from the royal box to the field level, could feel the Queen's disapproval like a weight on her shoulders. But she could also feel her children's excitement returning as they approached the action. When the organizer of the children's events recognized them and enthusiastically invited George and Charlotte to participate in the next round of competitions, held her breath. "Papa," George asked quietly, his voice full of hope but also uncertainty, "may I?" Watched William's internal struggle play out across his face. She could see him weighing tradition against his son's happiness, protocol against authentic engagement, his grandmother's expectations against his wife's convictions. "You know what, George?" William said finally, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "I think representing our family through participation rather than just observation might be exactly what's needed today. Let's show everyone what Cambridge determination looks like." The next hour was magical in a way that no amount of proper protocol could have achieved. George participated in 3 different competitions, not winning any of them, but throwing himself into each with enthusiasm and good sportsmanship. Charlotte charmed everyone with her fierce competitiveness and gracious congratulations to other participants. Even Louis got to participate in a simple toddler activity, clapping with delight at his participation ribbon. The crowd's response was overwhelmingly positive, watched as people pointed and smiled, clearly delighted to see the royal children engaging so authentically with Scottish traditions. Several spectators approached them with genuine warmth, sharing stories about their own children's participation in Highland games and expressing appreciation for the family's approachable demeanor. But the real vindication came from an unexpected source. As they were preparing to return to the royal box, noticed an elderly Scottish woman approaching them with obvious determination. She walked directly up to William briefly, and then spoke with the frank directness that Scots are famous for. "Your Royal Highness," she said, "I've been coming to these games for 60 years, and I've never seen anything as heartwarming as watching your children join in today. That's what real royalty looks like, not sitting apart from us, but being part of our communities and traditions. Your children will remember this day forever, and so will we." William's expression showed that her words had hit home. Could see him processing the fact that their more relaxed approach had actually enhanced rather than diminished the royal family's connection with their people. However, their triumph was tempered by the reality of facing the Queen afterward. During dinner that evening, the atmosphere was noticeably tense. The Queen's displeasure was evident in her formal tone and the way she addressed most of her comments to other family members while seeming to overlook William's contributions to conversation. The confrontation came after dinner, when the Queen requested a private word with William and in her sitting room. Felt her heart racing as they followed Her Majesty into the elegant room, knowing that this conversation would likely determine the future of their parenting approach within the broader royal context. "I am deeply disappointed," the Queen began without preamble, her voice carrying the authority of 7 decades on the throne. "The behavior I witnessed today was entirely inappropriate for members of the immediate royal family. The children showed a concerning lack of proper distance and dignity, and your encouragement of this behavior has set a troubling precedent." Felt William tense beside her, and knew that this was the moment when he would either support their new approach or retreat to the safety of traditional expectations. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, and prepared herself for the possibility that all their progress might be undone by institutional pressure. When William finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "Grandmother, with all due respect, I believe what you witnessed today was exactly what the monarchy needs in the 21st century. Our children weren't lacking in dignity. They were showing authentic engagement with their heritage and their people. The response from the crowd was overwhelmingly positive, and I believe that kind of genuine connection serves the crown far better than distant observation ever could." Felt a surge of pride and relief at William's words, but she also knew that challenging the Queen directly was a significant moment in their marriage and in their relationship with the broader royal family. The consequences of this conversation would extend far beyond their immediate family dynamics. The Queen's response would set the tone for everything that came next, and as waited for Her Majesty to speak, she realized that they had reached a point of no return. Their new approach to royal parenting was now being tested at the highest levels, and the outcome would determine not just their family's future, but potentially the evolution of royal traditions themselves. The silence that followed William's respectful challenge to the Queen seemed to stretch endlessly in the elegantly appointed sitting room at Balmoral. Felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched Her Majesty's expression, trying to read the thoughts behind those sharp, experienced eyes that had witnessed decades of royal tradition and change. The future of their family's approach to parenting, and perhaps the evolution of the monarchy itself, seemed to hang in the balance of this moment. When the Queen finally spoke, her voice was softer than had expected, carrying a note of something that sounded almost like wistfulness. "You know, William, when I was your age, I had many of the same concerns about balancing tradition with authenticity. The weight of preparing one's children for this life is unlike anything most people can imagine." She moved to the window that looked out over the Scottish Highlands, her silhouette framed against the dusky sky. "I remember watching your father as a young boy, trying to determine how much freedom to allow him, how much structure to impose. I made decisions based on what I believed was necessary to prepare him for his role, but I often wondered about the cost of those decisions. Exchanged a quick glance with William, both of them surprised by this unexpected vulnerability from someone they had always seen as unwavering in her convictions. The Queen turned back to face them and was struck by how much older she looked in this moment, not frail, but bearing the visible weight of decades of difficult decisions and their consequences. What I witnessed today challenged my assumptions about what constitutes proper royal behavior. But more than that, it reminded me of something I had perhaps forgotten in my focus on tradition and protocol. She moved to sit in her favorite chair, gesturing for William and to join her. The most successful monarchs in our history weren't successful because they followed every protocol perfectly. They were successful because they understood their people, could connect with them authentically, and led with both dignity and humanity. What I saw in your children today was genuine joy, natural curiosity, and instinctive kindness qualities that may serve the crown far better in the coming decades than rigid adherence to customs that sometimes create distance between the monarchy and the people we serve. William's surprise was evident in his expression. But grandmother, you always taught us that tradition and protocol were essential to maintaining the monarchy's dignity and relevance. And they are, the Queen replied firmly. But tradition without purpose becomes mere ceremony, and protocol without heart becomes performance rather than service. I've been watching the three of you navigate this balance for months now, and I confess I was concerned when I first noticed the changes in the children's behavior. But today showed me something important. She paused, choosing her words carefully. When George participated in those competitions today, he wasn't abandoning his royal identity. He was embodying the best aspects of it. He showed grace in both victory and defeat, genuine respect for the other participants, and natural leadership in encouraging younger children. Charlotte demonstrated the kind of confident authenticity that future generations will need from their princesses. And Louis. Well, Louis showed the pure joy that reminds people why they love the royal family in the first place. Felt tears pricking at her eyes as she realized that the Queen's criticism the night before had been based on initial impressions. But her natural wisdom and observational skills had led her to a deeper understanding of what she was actually witnessing. More importantly, the Queen continued, I watched how the people responded to them. There's been much discussion in recent years about the monarchy's relevance and future. Today, I saw three children who may well represent that future, and they were connecting with their heritage and their people in a way that felt both genuine and powerful. William leaned forward slightly, his voice tentative. So you're saying you approve of the changes we've made? The Queen's smile was slight but genuine. I'm saying that I believe you and have found something that I struggled to achieve with my own children, a way to prepare them for their roles without sacrificing their humanity. The monarchy's strength has always come from its ability to evolve while maintaining its core values. Perhaps it's time for our understanding of royal childhood to evolve as well. Found her voice finally, though it was somewhat shaky with emotion. Your Majesty, we never intended to abandon tradition or disrespect the customs you've worked so hard to maintain. We were just trying to find a way to raise children who could fulfill their royal duties with genuine confidence and joy rather than anxiety and rigid compliance. And you have succeeded, the Queen said simply. What I observed today wasn't a rejection of royal values. It was their authentic expression through children who are secure in themselves and genuinely excited about their heritage. That excitement, that natural confidence, those are gifts you can't teach through protocol lessons. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, with the Queen sharing stories from her own experiences as a mother and grandmother, the challenges she had faced in trying to prepare her children for royal life, and her reflections on which approaches had served them well and which she might change if given the opportunity. The hardest part of this role, she told them, is that every decision you make as a parent is also a decision about the future of an institution. The pressure to get it right can be overwhelming, and it's easy to fall back on traditional methods simply because they feel safer, more tested. But you've reminded me that sometimes the greatest service we can provide to the monarchy is to trust our instincts as parents and allow our children to develop into the kinds of people who will naturally serve with both competence and compassion. When they finally left the Queen's sitting room, felt as though a tremendous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The validation from the most senior member of the royal family meant everything for their ability to continue developing their approach without constantly second-guessing themselves or worrying about institutional disapproval. But the real transformation became evident over the remaining days of their visit to Balmoral. With the Queen's implicit approval of their methods, the entire family dynamic shifted into something more relaxed and natural. The children, sensing that they were no longer walking a tightrope between conflicting expectations, began to flourish in ways that surprised even. George, freed from the anxiety of constant evaluation, displayed natural leadership qualities that had been suppressed by his previous fear of making mistakes. During a family walk through the Highland trails, he naturally took charge of organizing games for his siblings, helped Louis navigate difficult terrain, and engaged confidently with the estate staff they encountered along the way. Charlotte's bold personality, no longer constrained by excessive concern about proper princess behavior, revealed itself as exactly the kind of charismatic confidence that would serve her well in future royal roles. Her natural ability to connect with people, to ask thoughtful questions, and to express genuine enthusiasm became assets rather than concerns. Even Louis, though still very much a toddler, seemed to benefit from the reduced tension in family interactions. His natural exuberance was channeled into appropriate contexts rather than constantly suppressed, and his infectious joy became a source of delight rather than anxiety for the adults around him. The Queen, observing these changes, became increasingly vocal in her support of William and his approach. During a formal dinner with other members of the royal family, she made a point of praising the children's development and specifically commending their parents' wisdom in finding a balance between tradition and authenticity. "The future of the monarchy," she declared to the assembled family, "lies not in rigid adherence to customs that may no longer serve their original purpose, but in raising children who embody our values naturally and joyfully. William and have shown us a path forward that honors our past while embracing the possibilities of our future." The impact of the Queen's endorsement extended far beyond their immediate family. Noticed that other royal family members began to reconsider their own approaches to child-rearing, asking questions about how they had managed to create such confident, well-adjusted children while still maintaining appropriate royal standards. More importantly, the validation allowed and William to embrace their new approach with complete confidence. They no longer felt the need to constantly justify or explain their methods. They could simply focus on being the best parents possible while trusting that their instincts were aligned with both their children's needs and their royal responsibilities. The journey back to London was markedly different from their arrival in Scotland. The children were relaxed, happy, and excited about returning to their regular activities. George talked animatedly about wanting to join his school's debate team, confident now that his natural curiosity and thoughtfulness were assets rather than potential sources of embarrassment. Charlotte made plans to audition for the school play, no longer worried that performing might be considered undignified for a princess. But perhaps the most significant change was in William himself. Watched her husband interact with their children during the journey home and saw someone who had finally reconciled his dual roles as father and future king. He was able to maintain appropriate expectations while celebrating their individual personalities, to provide guidance without crushing their spirits, and to prepare them for their futures while allowing them to enjoy their present. "You know," William said as they sat together on the train while the children played quietly nearby, "I think we've found something really important, not just for our family, but potentially for the entire institution." Nodded, watching George help Louis with a puzzle while Charlotte read a book aloud in different character voices. "I think we've proven that you can prepare children for extraordinary responsibilities without sacrificing their ordinary childhood happiness. Maybe that's the real evolution the monarchy needs, not abandoning tradition, but understanding which traditions serve the people and which ones serve only themselves." As they approached London, reflected on the journey they had taken as a family. It had been challenging, sometimes painful, and required both of them to question deeply held beliefs about parenting and royal duty. But the outcome, 3 children who were genuinely excited about their heritage, confident in themselves, and naturally inclined towards service and kindness, felt like validation of everything they had worked toward. The Queen's words echoed in his mind. The monarchy's strength has always come from its ability to evolve while maintaining its core values. They had found a way to evolve their approach to royal parenting while maintaining the values that truly mattered: service, dignity, compassion, and genuine connection with the people they would someday serve. As the train pulled into the station and their London life resumed, felt confident that they had built something sustainable and meaningful. Their children would grow up knowing they were loved unconditionally, that their worth wasn't dependent on perfect performance, and that their future roles were privileges to embrace rather than burdens to bear. Most importantly, they had proven that the next generation of royals could be both authentically human and appropriately royal, a combination that would serve the monarchy and the people it represents far better than rigid perfection ever could. The future looked brighter for the Cambridge children, and through them, for the institution they would one day lead with confidence, joy, and genuine connection to the people they serve.